Selma, a widow who had grown used to the solitude of her days, carried her heavy bundles of firewood as she did every morning. Her back ached, her hands were rough and cracked, and yet she walked the same dusty paths without complaint. To the villagers, she was invisible, a woman who bore not only wood, but the heavy weight of loss, of abandonment, and of a life that had offered her few joys. She moved through the village like a shadow, quiet, unnoticed, carrying her burdens in silence. But that morning, her familiar routine shattered. A movement on the roadside caught her eye. A man collapsed, clutching a tiny, sleeping baby in his arms. For a heartbeat, Selma hesitated. She could have walked past, as the village had often ignored her pain and her presence. But something inside her stirred, a spark of compassion that would not let her pass. She set down her firewood, leaving warmth and labor behind, and approached the two strangers. Without question, she lifted the man and the child, guiding them toward the only sanctuary she could provide, her modest home, a place filled with old memories, the scent of past years, and more prayers than conversation. Selma laid the man gently on the straw mat that had once belonged to her late husband. It was the only corner of the house that still carried his scent. Yet she did not hesitate. She adjusted his head on a folded, clean cloth, covered his worn feet with a blanket that had long been untouched, and carefully placed the baby in a woven basket lined with floral fabric, a piece she had preserved from her days of sewing for others. She carried water from the well, boiled it over the clay stove, and with a warm cloth began to wash the man's cracked, dirt-caked feet, each mark telling the story of a journey without rest. Every motion was accompanied by whispered words, soft prayers to God and quiet murmurs to her own fears. The baby did not stir. It slept as if it understood, as if it knew it had found the safety it had never known. Selma gazed at the child's tiny, defenseless face, feeling a pang of tenderness and sorrow. She had wanted children of her own. She and Bombo had tried, for years, and each month that passed without a child brought tears that fell unseen in the yard. And now, here was a child in her arms given not by blood, but by fate, by choice, by chance. She prepared a thin porridge of white corn, adding just a touch of milk, stirring it with care, testing it on the back of her hand, then feeding it to the child with a small wooden spoon. The baby sucked slowly, deliberately, as if savoring not only the food but the warmth and calm of a home, the quiet affection offered in silence. Meanwhile, the man breathed weakly but steadily, suspended between sleep and the slow, painful return to life. Selma studied his face. Young, yet marked with lines of suffering, eyes closed, brows furrowed as though haunted by painful dreams. He wore no ring, no papers in his pockets, only a simple necklace of blue beads, a token of faith from a distant land. Hours passed, the sun tracing arcs across the sky, yet Selma did not leave his side. She slept upright on a straw chair, her headscarf slipping, body aching, but heart alert. She changed compresses, kept the baby fed, and sang an old lullaby her mother had once sung, a song steeped in memories of war, loss, and survival. On the third day, before dawn fully broke, the man stirred. His eyes opened slowly, blinking against the dim light. He attempted to sit, but groaned, pain etched in every movement. Selma brought a gourd of hot leaf tea, sitting beside him quietly. His eyes met hers, confused, and then he whispered, hoarse and fragile, "Where am I?" Selma did not answer immediately. She simply looked at him, eyes deep and steady, carrying the weight of loss and survival, the patience of someone who had lost everything yet still gave shelter. After a long pause, she said, "You're alive, and that's already much more than yesterday." He closed his eyes again, understanding the unspoken depth of her words. And so began the quiet rebirth. not with promises or explanations, but with simple acts of care. He spoke little, breathed slowly, and that was enough. Over the next 3 sunrises, the villagers began to notice smoke rising earlier from Selma's chimney, but their gazes were not filled with concern. Gossip traveled faster than the wind in the village, and a widow harboring a man and a child was enough to set tongues wagging. The first to notice were sisters Adaku and Ina, old women with soft voices masking sharpened tongues. They saw Selma, washing clothes, the baby tied to her back, and whispered venomously, "Since when does she carry a child? She never had one, and now she shows up with a baby. And that man, who brought him? Looks like he came to stay," the other added, peering through narrowed eyes. The whispers grew to murmurs, murmurs to gossip at the well, in the market, and at prayer corners. They judged, speculated, and gossiped, rarely pausing to ask if Selma was all right, if she needed help, or if the act was born of necessity. Selma heard, not because she sought it, but because venom always finds a way to pierce the calm. She answered only with silence, continuing her work, her slow movements deliberate. Years had taught her that the loudest voices often carried the least truth. Yet, behind her composed exterior lay a quiet fear. The fear that he might leave, as others had in her life. Family had drifted away after she became a widow, friends had vanished with time, hope had knocked but never entered. Each time he stepped out to fetch water or firewood, Selma watched from the window, hands clasped as if to hold absence at bay. He always returned, but fear did not know certainty. Fear only understood emptiness. One scorching afternoon. As Selma swept the yard, 2 young women passed, laughing. "She's younger now. Must be the miracle of a man," one said. The other burst into a laugh that stung more sharply than a slap. Selma froze mid-sweep, breathed deeply, looked to the sky, and continued. Each piece of straw cleared from the yard felt like she was brushing off a bit of the dirt their words tried to place on her soul. Inside comma. The man, whose name she had not yet learned, began to regain strength. He walked short steps, cradling the baby with gentle care, as if holding a fragile secret. He asked little, watched her quietly, and thanked her with his eyes. Eyes that spoke more than words ever could. In that village, where gossip worked harder than compassion, Selma continued, her care, feeding, comforting, sheltering, while enduring tongues that offered nothing but stones. Slowly, her home, once quiet and empty, began to fill with something new, an unspoken warmth that had no name yet, but was already being felt. Within the house, silence took on a new meaning. It was no longer absence, but recognition. 2 hearts, tentative and cautious, drawing closer with faith that perhaps what appeared to be chance was actually an answer. Days passed in the rhythm of corn porridge and sun-dried leaves. Gradually, the man began to speak, word by word, fragment by fragment, testing whether the ears listening could be trusted. His name was Kaibu. His voice, hoarse at first, grew steadier, as he spoke of his son, Tumo, a name meaning root that survives the drought, a fitting emblem for their survival. Kaibu was a bricklayer, hands roughened by labor, skilled at weighing earth and measuring walls. He had known great sorrow. His wife, Nandila, had died in childbirth, leaving him to carry both grief and son, the half of his heart that remained. He had sought refuge with relatives, first with her parents, then an uncle, then a sister, but found only cold indifference. A man alone with a child, they said, drags others down. Understanding their pain, he still felt the emptiness it left behind. And so, he had left with no destination, carrying his son on his back, and a weariness that weighed not just on his body, but on his soul. He walked along dusty roads, carrying both boy and burden, until fate and Selma's hands intervened dot trails. Kama slept in empty porches, drank from rivers, ate when someone felt pity until one day his strength gave out. It wasn't a choice. His body collapsed before he could ask for help. And that's how Selma found him. When he told her this, Selma said nothing. She just poured more broth into his bowl and Hearye's shimmered. Not with pity, she knew the taste of abandonment too well to fall for cheap compassion. What she saw in that man felt familiar, the kind of loneliness carried with dignity. The effort not to grow bitter, even after so many closed doors. Over time, Kaibu began to help, first by sweeping Thayard, then splitting firewood, then fixing a window that had long creaked. Wasn't out of obligation. It was gratitude. It was as if moving his body helped heal the silence in his soul. Tumo, in turn, grew like a flower after the rain. He looked at Selma with the kind of wonder only children possess, reached his little hands out to her, babbled sounds that weren't yet words, but already held meaning, and every time she picked him up, something inside her trembled. It was as if time turned back, as if life whispered, "I still have something to give you." The village, of course, still kept its ears perked. The whispers still floated behind half-open doors, but with less force. Some said Kawa's a disguised vagabond. Others swore he was a fugitive, but none of them stepped inside that house to see what was really being born there. One afternoon, asked almost in a whisper, "Why didn't you leave the boy with someone, some woman in the family?" Kaibu took a while to respond. Looked out the window where Tuma was playing with a corn cob as if it were treasure because no one wanted him. And if no one wanted him, then I didn't want to live anymore either. The words hung in the air like a heavy cloud ready to burst, but it didn't rain. Selma simply nodded, eyes misty. She understood more than he knew because she too once had wanted to disappear when she realized the world no longer wanted her around. And so the stranger's story slowly unfolded like worn cloth, revealing patches, stitches, scars. And the more he told her, the more she saw that it wasn't by chance he had collapsed right on her path. It was as if fate, tired of watching two good souls be overlooked, had decided to bring them together. Not so that one could save the other, but so that together they could remember that tenderness still existed in this world, even if hidden at the edges of pain. Time in the village wasn't measured by clocks, but by the gestures of routine, the clang of the pestle, the smell of corn roasting on the clay stove, the crowing of roosters, the evening prayers. And within that rhythm of daily life, little Tumor was growing, his feet still fragile, but his gaze alert, bright, curious in the way only a child's eyes can be. In Selma's house, the baby already knew the corners. He knew where the late afternoon sun hit the warmest, where the floor was coolest, and where to crawl when he wanted attention. He was a quiet boy, rarely crying, often silent, as if he had inherited from his absent mother a gentleness and from his father a quiet strength. But there was something else in him, something no one could name. But Selma felt a bond built not by blood, but by the daily active care. She wasn't his grandmother, not family, but she was the constant presence, the arms always open, the voice that rocked him to sleep, even out of tune. One morning, while Kaibu was reinforcing the roof with new palm leaves, Selma sat on the doorstep with Tumo in her lap. He was restless, as if something inside him was about to bloom. He drooled a bit, clutched the fabric of her dress tightly, and moved his mouth as if trying to speak the whole world. Then suddenly, without warning, he looked straight at her, right into her eyes, and smiled. Not one of those vague reflex smiles. Babies often give, but a full smile, drenched in life, a smile of the soul. His round face lit up, his eyes sparkled, and his mouth opened in a pure gesture of wonder. He reached his tiny hand to her face, and, for a moment, time stood still. Selma was startled, not because she had never seen a baby smile. She had seen many, but because she couldn't remember the last time someone had looked at her like that, as if she were the safest, most beautiful thing in the world. That little hand on her wrinkled face felt like a blessing, a silent confirmation. You matter. Her heart, which for years had beat to the rhythm of mere survival, skipped. It wasn't romantic love. It wasn't a friend's gratitude. It was a tenderness that felt like soft rain on cracked earth. And in that moment, Selma felt something shift, as if some long-forgotten part of her, buried deep in her chest, was coming back to life. She laughed, a quiet, bashful laugh, like someone rediscovering they still know how to smile. Then she looked up at the sky and whispered, "Thank you." Kaibu, watching from a distance, paused his work. He saw his son in Selma's arms, saw the smile. They shared and took a deep breath. That man who had once stared death in the face realized something. Life sometimes restarts through the simplest of gestures. He already knew his son was safe, but more than that, he was loved. That afternoon, Selma made a special meal. She took the last piece of dried fish he kept in a gourd on the high shelf and made a stew with okra leaves and cornmeal. When she set the plates on the small table, Kiba noticed the effort, and he said nothing, because he knew the gesture wasn't just about feeding hunger. It was a silent celebration. They ate in peace, the baby on her lap, tapping his tiny hand on the edible like he was part of the feast. Selma looked at the two of them and felt warmth in her chest. It wasn't illusion, It wasn't naive hope. It was something deeper, older. A kind of feeling that doesn't need a name because it's felt in the body, in the gesture, in the tear that escapes without asking. That night, lying on her mat, Selma took a while to fall asleep. She stared at the ceiling, listening to the breath of Tumo and Kaibu in the next room, and she thought not about the village whispers, not about the absences of the past, but about that smile. That small smile had pierced a hole in the wall. She had built around her heart a wall made of pain, of disappointments, of broken promises. But now, through that little crack, light was starting to come in, and though she didn't know what would come next, for now, this was enough. The baby smiled, and it was at her. The days that followed passed like dust after the rain, lighter, gentler, with the scent of damp earth and the promise of a new beginning. Kaibu, now recovered, walked with steady steps. The eyes that once searched only for rest now looked to the horizon with unease, and that didn't go unnoticed by Selma, who watched from afar with the kind of gaze only those who have lost much possess, one that recognizes the signs of leaving. Even without wanting to, he spoke less, answered with gestures, helped more than necessary. He gathered firewood before dawn, patched cracks in the wall, fetched water before she could ask. And each of these gestures, though they seemed like gratitude, carried the quiet weight of goodbye. One morning, Kaibu sat at the edge of the yard with a simple bundle, an old cloth tied up with a few clothes, a piece of soap, and the blue bead necklace he always kept with him. When Selma saw it, her stomach sank. She didn't ask, didn't question. She simply stopped what she was doing, wiped her hands on her apron, and stood there watching. Kaibu stood, holding little Tumo in his arms. He walked toward her with a quiet respect, as if that moment required more than words, and said without evasion, but with his heart in his eyes, "It's time. I can't stay any longer." Selma didn't respond. She pressed her lips together as if swallowing a prayer left unsaid. Tumo began to fuss, as if sensing something. He shifted in his father's arms, searching for her face, reached out his tiny hand the way he did when he wanted her to hold him. Kaibu lowered his eyes, took a step, then stopped. "You've done more than anyone. You saved us both. But I need to try again somewhere else, Dot. Maybe start from zero." She nodded, not in agreement, but in acceptance. Because when you love in silence, even goodbye is an act of love. She turned, walked into the house, went. To the corner where she kept the last clean cloth Andre turned with it in her hands. "Take this. It'll keep the boy safe from the wind," she said. Her voice steady though inside, her soul was cracking. Kaibu took the cloth, wrapped Tumo carefully, thanked her with a look that spoke louder than any blessing. He walked to the wooden gate, pushed it open gently, and left. The time that followed was made of absence. Selma didn't cry, didn't groan. She just cleaned the house as always, swept the yard, stirred the food, but everything felt like it was missing. The baby's plate still sat in the corner, his blanket folded on top of the basket. The chair where Kaibu used to sit at night, empty. When the sun set, she lit the oil lamp like every night, but the light seemed dimmer. She sat near the window, stared out at the darkness of the road, and sighed. Part of her had always known this moment would come, but another part, more stubborn, had dreamed of a kind of staying, even if small dot then, just as the night was about to settle in. The sound of footsteps on dirt came like a whisper. Far at, first, then closer. Selma rose slowly, her heart stumbling in her chest. She opened the door carefully. There was Kaibu standing, his face wet, not from rain, but from something deeper. Tumo, already asleep in the cloth she had given, rested peacefully in his father's arms. He didn't speak right away. He just looked at her like someone returning. "To the only place where his heart could rest. My son sleeps better here," he said finally in a low voice. "But I think it's me who sleeps in peace." Selma didn't move a muscle, didn't run to him, didn't weep. She simply stepped aside, making room like someone who understands that some departures are only meant to show where the real beginning is. He stepped inside, placed the child in the basket, sat in the chair, and the silence, once heavy, now felt like home, a silence of belonging. That night, no one slept, early. The oil lamp stayed lit long into the night, not out of need, but because it was beautiful to see that soft light dancing on the walls, as if celebrating the return of something that should never have left. Kaibu had wanted to leave, but he didn't. And that, without promises, without vows, without ceremony, was the most intimate act of staying Selma had ever known. The clouds came without warning. That afternoon they arrived heavy, not just with rain, but with a sense of foreboding. The air thickened, the wind shifted, and the sky, once clear, darkened like a dirty sheet being stretched over the world. Selma watched the horizon with eyes trained by time. She knew the signs of a storm, but that night, what she feared most didn't come from the sky. It came from the heat burning on Tumo's skin. It started with a cry that wouldn't stop. Not fussiness, not hunger, a deep, relentless wail that tore through the soul. The boy who once slept in peaceful trust in the arms that rocked him now found no comfort. Not on his father's chest, not in the sway of the hammock. Kaibu paced back and forth, desperate. He tried everything he knew. Cool leaves on the forehead, warm baths, lullabies, but nothing worked. Selma placed her palm on the boy's forehead and felt the heat rise, fierce, like burning embers. The fever scorched, and it scorched with the fury of one too small to explain what they felt. The storm hit hard. Rain pounded the roof like drums of sorrow. The wind howled through the cracks in the house, as if dragging prayers away, but Selma didn't let fear take her. She cradled the boy in her arms, sat on the dirt floor, and right there, knees bent, head bowed, she began to pray. It wasn't a memorized prayer, not from books, not from old hymns. It was a prayer of someone bleeding from the inside, a plea made from the soul with a locked throat and an open chest. My God, Hear what I don't know how to say. I've already lost everything, but not him. He had just arrived. If you must take my days, take my strength, but let him live. Even if I don't see tomorrow, even if he grows up far from me, let this child stay. Kaibu heard the plea and cried like a child, not just out of fear, but helplessness. The helplessness of watching everything slip away again. Once he had lost his wife in childbirth, now his child in his arms. The hours of that night were torture. The child's body trembled and sweated all at once. Eyes shut, face flushed, lips dry. Selma and Kaibu took turns in silence. Cool cloths on. His forehead whispered sweet words, soft songs, desperate cries to the heavens. And then, when the first rays of morning tore through the darkness, something changed. The crying stopped. Tumo breathed slower. The heat on his forehead began to fade. His chest rose and fell more calmly. Kaibu lifted him into his arms, panicked, and looked at Selma, his eyes wide with disbelief. She came closer, pressed her face gently to the boy's, and felt the coolness of life returning. She said nothing, just placed a hand over her chest, as if holding in her heart, thumping, relieved. Kaibu dropped to his knees. He cried again, but this time it was a different cry. The cry of someone who had been heard of someone who, without understanding how, had just witnessed a miracle that the day dawned in peace. The storm was behind them, like a forgotten nightmare. The boys leapt soundly, and the house, though exhausted, felt stronger. There was something new there, a sense of victory without trophies, of grace without applause. In the village, no one knew what had happened. No one saw the battle fought in that house between fever and faith. But Selma knew, and she also knew, that prayer, the one that escaped between sobs and promises, had not been in vain. From that day on, she looked at Tuma with more than tenderness. She looked with reverence, as if the boy had returned from a place only the pure can reach. And Kaibu, once reserved, grew closer. He began to touch Selma's hand more often, as if thanking her, not only for saving his son, but for saving the part of him that still believed in life. In the village, the morning carried on as usual. But in that house something had changed forever, because there they had learned or remembered that when all seems lost, a soul in prayer can still carve paths through the dark. And sometimes it's in the silence, between the last hope and the first miracle, that the truest faith lives. Time, which once seemed to pass indifferently to Kibu's presence in the village, began to show signs that his silence had weight. And the curious eyes of the neighbors, once so focused on whispering about Selma, now began to notice something else. That man's hands, discreet but steady, did more than carry his son and sweep the yard. They made repairs. They held up walls. They organized the spaces of the house, like someone building not just a structure, but a kind of hope. It was on a hot, heavy morning, after a night of dry thunder and fierce wind, that the unexpected struck the village, the wooden bridge connecting. The village tow, the market, and the neighboring school collapsed under the weight of a cart. No one was hurt, but the shock was real. It was an old bridge built in the days of their ancestors, and for years had been patched together with makeshift fixes. Now the river hadn't just carried away planks. It had swept away the communities. Trust. The elders gathered under the sacred tree to discuss what to do. There were few options. Bringing someone from the city would be expensive and slow. Some men volunteered to try repairs, but none had the skill required. The village used Tasmal home fixes didn't know how to rebuild something so essential. That's when a younger voice, one of Ina's sons, yes. The same neighbor who once mocked Selma spoke up loud and without hesitation. There's a man here who knows to do it. The one living with the widow. A silence fell. Those who once whispered now had to swallow their pride. Kibu asked the village chief, raising an eyebrow. He knows how to build bridges. He's a mason, a good one. I saw how he reinforced her house. That wall that was about to fall, it's better than it was before. The decision was made then and there. They sent for Kaibu. He arrived humbly, wearing the same clothes as always. His son tied Tohis back with one of Selma's cloths. He didn't say much, listened to the instructions, examined the fallen structure, walked along the river banks, and after some time in silence, said, "I'll need strong rope, dry wood, and willing hands. With that, the bridge will stand again." There were murmurs, hesitation, but with no other solution, they trusted him. And day by day, Kaibu led the work with firmness and respect. He didn't shout, didn't command, he showed with his hands. He built with patience. And slowly, the men of the village began to look at him differently. He was no longer the stranger without a past. He was the man who knew, who taught without arrogance, who shared the burden without complaint. Selma watched. From afar, pride tucked quietly in her chest. She saw how the boy smiled watching his father work. And she saw, too, how the same women who once avoided her now passed more slowly by her door, trying to make small talk. When the bridge was finished, solid, safe, more beautiful than before, a celebration was held, small as everything there was, but full of meaning that brought food, lit a bonfire, sang old songs, and in the middle of the celebration, the village chief raised his hand and said, "In front of everyone, this man restored our path. He deserves our honor and our invitation to stay." Kaibu, without rising, simply pointed. With one finger, he indicated the clay house. Simple. Where Selma sat waiting, baby in her arms. "I'm already where I belong." No one said a word. Because in that moment, even the most hardened hearts understood it wasn't about land or shelter. It was about belonging, about finding a place in the world where your soul can finally rest. And on that day, as drums beat and people danced, the village learned, without anyone needing to say it, that the man who once arrived, slumped over a widow's shoulder, was now carrying them all with the strength of a new beginning. And the bridge, the rebuilt with sweat and silence, didn't just connect to riverbanks. It connected stories. It connected hearts. It linked the past to the present. And quietly, without ceremony, it sealed Kaibu's place in that land. The village which not long ago whispered Selma's name with scorn at muddy corners, and in line at the well now murmured in a different tone. It was no longer the language of mockery, but of guilt disguised. The same ones who turned up their noses when she took Kaibu, and were now twisting their bodies to get a better look when he passed by with Tumo in his arms. And the same women who used to call her the lonely widow now bowed their heads in greeting, their shy smiles heavy with old regret that it all began with the child. Tumo, now a bit older, walked in stumbling steps, tripping over his own feet, but with a joy so infectious no one could resist. The women couldn't help but be charmed by that bright-eyed boy with a loud laugh. At the market, while bartered cassava, or traded corn for soap, arms would reach out to touch him. "What a beautiful boy. He has his mother's smile. She's a lucky woman." And each of those phrases, though dressed as compliments, carried a late recognition. What was once scorned was now admired. Then came compliments about her food. One neighbor walked past her house, and catching the smell of fresh cornmeal mush with dender oil, couldn't resist. "Selma, is that you cooking? Teach me how to make that angle, woman." She responded with a timid nod, still not used to the new tone. For a long time, those mouths had only served her poison. Now they came with honey. And honey, when it follows so much bitterness, takes time to go down. But it didn't take long. The invitations started arriving. First, discreet, almost shy. "There's tea at Anup's place. Come by. Jew's wife made Mana want to share." Selma hesitated, her heart still HD from old words. But Kaibu, sensing her doubt, simply said, "It's not for them. It's for you. Sometimes the soul needs to leave the house too." So she went. That first time, she sat silently, listened more than she spoke. The women tried to make small talk, complimented the baby, asked about the weather, the crops, the new harvest. Selma replied with care that she didn't hold grudges, but she also didn't offer her soul on a platter. She knew the value of silence and how it can teach more than 1,000 words, but as days passed, the gatherings became more frequent. No more invitations were needed. The scent of brewing coffee was enough for Selma to show up, carrying a clean cloth, a gourd of milk, and a quiet gesture of sharing Dot. And when she spoke, her voice carried weight, because it was the voice of someone who'd cried too much, who had carried more than firewood. She carried abandonment, contempt, loneliness, and even so she kept going. The others listened, and slowly they began to trust her, to seek her counsel, to share their own sorrows. One woman spoke of the son who left without looking back. Another of a husband who still lived in the house but no longer lived in her heart, and Selma listened without judgment, because she knew those pains. She had lived every one of them in one way or another. One day, during one of those gatherings, the oldest woman in the group, a respected elder named Mama Decca, looked at Selma and said, "You look more beautiful." Selma smiled without vanity. She knew it wasn't her face nor a new headscarf. It was a different kind of beauty, the kind that comes from surviving without bitterness, the kind that remains standing when others tried to bend her, the kind that comes from caring, from sheltering, from loving with faith, even without promises. In that village where tongues were always quicker than hearts, a new habit was born. Stopping by Selma's home to ask about the baby, to request a recipe, to share some bread. And she, who once carried only silences, now carried stories, hers and everyone else's. The aunt's empty yard became a gathering place. Children played, men greeted with respect, women sat under the shade of the cashew tree and laughed. Not because life was perfect, but because now there was company, and where they sharing, even pain feels smaller. The whispers, once sharp like knives, had lost their edge. Not because they were forgotten, but because they were overcome. And Selma, without ever raising her voice, without ever apologizing for being who she was, had earned something rare: respect. And so, through warm tea, shared bread, and open eyes, the woman once judged for taking someone in was now welcomed by the very ones who had judged her, because time, that old wise friend, always sides with kindness, even when it arrives silently, barefoot, and with a wounded heart. The rainy season passed, carrying with it the last remnants of old suspicions that still lingered in the corners of the village. The earth dried again with dignity, and the air once more smelled of grass and charcoal. Everything seemed to be in its rightful place. But in Selma's house, something still pulsed. It wasn't doubt nor fear. It was waiting. Kaibu had never been a man of many words. Even after months living there, sharing life, bread, and pain, he kept a certain distance when it came to speaking. He used his body to say what others try to say with promises. He showed he was there, present, steady. But deep down, Selma knew. Some things only become real through the right gesture, the right word spoken at just the right time. She never asked for it. She wasn't one to demand. Her soul had long learned that when you truly love, you don't beg someone to stay. You offer shelter and wait to see if they choose to make it home. That night, the sky was clear, the moon, round, like a leather drum, lit the earth with its soft glow. Selma had just put Tumo to bed. The boy, now older, spoke short words and laughed like someone who knows they are loved. He slept with his arms open like someone unafraid of the world. Kaibu was outside, seated on the log he used as a bench. His eyes were fixed on the sky as if looking for answers in the silence of the stars. Selma stepped out with a cloth over her shoulders, sat beside him, and together they stayed quiet for long minutes. The kind of silence that only exists between two people who have shared the same kind of pain. He was the first to speak. I thought I knew what it meant to live, work, be with someone, move forward, but all of that was just motion, real life. I only understood it there. Selma didn't look at him, kept her gaze fixed on the dark, but her breathing changed. It deepened as if holding her breath, afraid that breaking the stillness would also break the spell. Kaibu went on. You saved two men, Salim, when no one else saved even one. You saved my son, and you saved me too. She closed her eyes. The words entered like arrows. But they didn't wound. They touched. They warmed. They rekindled. Yes, that was it. Exactly what her heart had. Always known in silence that what she did for the two of them went far beyond care. It was a way of giving back to life what life had once taken from her. Then Kaibu took her hand gently, as if asking permission to touch her soul before touching her skin. He held it firmly and said, I don't want to leave anymore, not because you took us in, not out of gratitude, but because this is the only place I feel whole with you. Selma didn't sob, didn't shout, didn't beam with joy, but one single tear fell slow, serene, like a river that finally finds its way back home. She squeezed his hand in return, didn't say a word, and didn't have to. Sometimes the deepest answer is the silence that comes after the touch. That very night, he added another lock to the front door, reinforced the chicken coop fence, and before going to bed, stood in the corner of the room where he used to sleep, and said, I'm going to build a new room. This house deserves space for everyone, and you deserve comfort. It was the start of something bigger. Not a wedding, not a ceremony, but a covenant born from the everyday, from steady glances, from mutual respect, a union of those who meet through pain, but stay because of love. And Selma, who once believed her fate was to carry firewood in silence, until the end of her life, now saw that time, that patient craftsman had carved a new story for her. And that, contrary to what the village's hasty tongues once said, love isn't only for the young or the beautiful or those who have everything. True love is for those who have the courage to keep loving even after everything. And in that yard, beneath the full moon, two weary souls were finally allowing themselves to rest in each other. Time, which so often weighs like a burden on the backs of those who've suffered too much, now seemed to flow more gently in the clay house, where once only silence lived. Selma's house, once a shadow of grief, had become a refuge of life. The new room Kaibu had promised, was already taking shape. Brick by brick, plank by plank, he raised not only walls but a new meaning for that place. Tumo, now steady on his feet, ran barefoot through the yard. He was a strong boy, full of laughter and bright eyes. He called Sema Mineha Little Mama without anyone ever teaching him the word. It came out naturally, as if his blood recognized the soul that loved him more than any blood tie ever could. And when Selma heard it for the first time, that maha, clumsy, on the tongue, but sure in the heart, she nearly fell to her knees. She didn't cry in front of the boy, but she went into her room, knelt before the cloth she used as an altar, and gave thanks, not for being alive, but for at last feeling truly alive. Women from the village came more and more often. Someto asked for recipes, others to share secrets, and many just to sit under the shade of the cashew tree and listen to Selma speak. She, who had once been seen as the bitter widow, was now sought as a counselor. And what surprised everyone the most was that she held no grudge. She welcomed them all with the same calm gaze, the same small but honest smile. One day, Mama Deka, the elder no one dared contradict, said aloud, "Who would have thought?" Huh? The woman who once carried firewood alone now carries a whole home, and no one disagreed. Because they saw a transformation not made of gold or titles, but of care. They saw a man who once lay unconscious, by the roadside, now building walls, harvesting cassava, teaching the young men to work with dignity. They saw a baby, once asleep in the arms of despair, now darting like sunlight between the legs of the neighbors. And they saw Selma. They saw that she wasn't just a widow. She was root. She was refuge. She was living proof that love, when it is true, doesn't belong only to the young. The new room was finished on a morning when the sky was cotton-colored. It was simple like everything there, but it had space. A new mat, a wooden bench in the corner, and the feeling that no one would ever again need to sleep on the floor. Caillou never won for grand declarations, simply called Selma to see it. He didn't say, "This is for you." He didn't say, "It's the least you deserve." He simply said, "Now there's room for everyone. No more squeezing in." Selma looked at the room and saw more than bricks. She saw respect. She saw partnership. She saw future. And for her, the future wasn't made of distant promises. It was made of small, shared routines. The coffee brewed. At the same hour, the corn planted together, the laughter during Tumo's bath. The glance, sex changed at night when all was quiet. In one of those silences, Tumo came running, stumbling over his own feet, and threw himself into lap. He cupped her face in his little hands and said, "Mineha, you're good." She held him tightly, and in that embrace she understood everything. The woman who once carried pain in her body and longing in her chest now carried love in her arms. The man, who once collapsed unconscious in the middle of the road, now held up a home. And the child, once on the verge of being forgotten by the world, now stood as living proof that hope, when nurtured, blooms. Selma didn't forget Bombo. She never denied her past, but she had learned that grief, when held with dignity, doesn't prevent love from returning. It simply teaches it to arrive more gently, more wisely, and with more truth. The village, which had always looked with haste, now looked more carefully, and they learned, even if silently, a powerful truth. The bundle of firewood Selma dropped that day had become the fire of welcome inside her home. A fire that didn't burn, but warmed, that didn't frighten, but gathered. And so it was that the widow they all thought had reached her end began again. Not with a new name, not with a new appearance, but with the same soul as always. Now finally seen, Selma's house was no longer just a house. It had become a symbol, a reference point in the village. Not because it was the biggest or the most beautiful, but because something rare lived there. The miracle of beginning again. Not a miracle made of lightning or visions, but one built with patience, humility, and quiet faith. There, in that simple home, life was reborn, where others saw only endings. The woman who once carried pain, the way others carry firewood, bent, silent, ignored, now walked with her head held high, her steps steady, her heart at peace. Not because the world had forgiven her, but because she had forgiven herself for once, believing that it was too late to love, too late to be loved, too late to matter. Kaibu, the man who had collapsed by the side of the road, now held up a home with strong hands, simple words, and steady presence. He never promised the heavens, but he built solid ground. He turned his gratitude into daily action, not a debt. And with each gesture of care, he repaid not just the welcome, but the trust of being seen as a man, even when all he had left was exhaustion and pain. Tumo, the boy who'd arrived asleep in the arms of despair, now ran with firm feet and a light soul. He was growing up surrounded by love, unaware of the losses that came before him, but feeling in every embrace, every look, every word that his life was the fruit of choices made with the heart. He called Selma Minha with the ease of someone who knows that a mother is not just who gives birth, but who stays, who cares, who gives without asking anything in return. And the village, so quick to judge, had learned slowly through time and example. It learned that the eyes do not always see what the heart knows, that loneliness doesn't define a person, that there's wisdom in those who stay silent in the face of gossip, strength in those who offer shelter without condition, and beauty in those who begin again from the broken pieces. Silently, the village recognized its fault, and it was insolence, too, that they began to honor Selma's presence. The women brought her healing leaves. The men sought her advice on crops. The children followed her with laughter, not because she made herself important, but because she had remained good. Selma never wanted to be an example. She never sought detention. She simply acted from the heart. And destiny, that old storyteller, did not forget her. It took its time, yes, but it came with justice. It returned what she had given freely for so many years: care, affection, presence, faith. And that's how the woman who once carried only pain came to carry love. The man who fell with no strength now sustained a home. The child who once slept in the arms of despair awoke in the lap of hope. The village learned not through sermons, but through lived life, that those who save also need saving. And that bundle of firewood that Selma dropped that day by the side of the road when she saw that man and that baby became fire. Not fire that destroys, but fire that welcomes, fire that cooks, fire that warms, fire that gathers, fire of home, fire of faith, fire of family. If this story touched your heart, let us know where you're watching from. Leave a comment below. We'd love to hear from you. Don't forget to like the video, share it with your friends and family, and subscribe to the channel. That really helps us keep bringing you real and emotional stories like this one. Thank you for being part of our